Welcome to the Dunamis EQ podcast, where we talk to great leaders, people who lead with emotional intelligence. We hear their stories, we understand how they think, how they've learned, how they've gotten to where they are, and hopefully that empowers you to go on your own journey with emotional intelligence. Today, I have the privilege of being joined by Darren Long. So Darren was someone who was recommended to me by one of my really good friends who had worked with Darren while he was at Sky. So we're just going to understand a bit more about Darren, how he works, how he thinks, and what's made him the great leader that he is today. So Darren, thank you so much for joining.
No problem. Nice to meet you and nice to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very nice to meet you too. This is the first time we're meeting, first time we're talking. So everyone's going to get the opportunity to hear how we get to know each other, which is quite cool.
Sounds fun.
So let's start with, who are you? Like, what do you do? Where have you been? Like, tell us a little bit about your career journey so far.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So my early careers, I've been in the industry for quite a long time now. I mean, broadcast industry, but my passion, and certainly the thing where I started as when I was very young, is I love photography, and certainly
Okay.
it was somewhere I always thought I was going to end up, but didn't. But it became sort of more of a hobby than a job. But it definitely moved me on, and I knew aged 9 what I wanted to do. I know that sounds very strange. A lot of people don't know what they're going to do when they're sort of that age, but I'm probably one of those odd people that had an incident, and it was a really silly incident that kind of wanted. I knew at that point I wanted to come into the broadcast industry, and that was I went to the Horse of the Year show in Birmingham as a young boy, as you do. And behind me was a cameraman,
Right.
and he was obviously filming the event. And I was looking that way most of the time while the event was happening this way. Wow. And I came away that day, age 9, going, right, that's what I want to be. I want everyone to be a cameraman, of course. But I continued my passion by sort of taking pictures. As I grew up and sort of was in my sort of early teens, I worked for a local photographer, working for him, and that taught me a lot of things, certainly about sort of working with people. But then it kind of spurred me on. And then literally when I left university, I knew that I wanted to work in film or TV, and I wasn't particularly sure where and what. So I was very lucky that I saw a job advert for the National Film and Television School in Beaconsfield.
Okay.
And it was for a trainee video engineer, they called it in those days. And I was very lucky to actually start there. Had 7 years of amazing scholarship, really, because not only was I somebody who was obviously being paid for doing a job and training and going to sort of college and learning about electronics and television broadcasts and all the rest of it. But equally, I was working with students. And the great thing with that is I got all the benefit of working with students, because it meant that I could go on the courses they went on. It meant I learned about film. I learned about TV. I learned about lighting. I worked with some of the great directors out there. And I worked with some really talented students who became amazing in what they did. And one of the famous ones that I worked with was a guy called Nick Park, who invented Wallace and Gromit.
No way.
Yeah. So I worked with him on the first film he did, which was The Grand Day Out. And he asked me whether or not I would help him to build the spaceship and all the electronics that was in the spaceship and everything.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so I was very lucky to work with him. But in a nutshell, I think that grounding really taught me something around sort of what I wanted to be. And so I graduated, I graduated from the National Film and TV School after 7 years. I kind of got a number of qualifications at that point. I decided I wanted to go on and work at a proper mainstream broadcast centre. So I was looking, and one day I spotted this advert, and it said Sky Channel, and I showed it to my then boss, who sort of said, "I've never heard of them, don't know who they are."
That's unimaginable now. I
Well,
can't
it
even
is
imagine that.
unimaginable, but just
Yeah.
remember what it was in those days. So I'm
Yeah.
talking back in 1988, 89.
That's just when it started, right?
No, well, it was before when it was started. So 88,
Right.
89. So,
Okay.
so effectively, it was called Sky Channel. It was run out of Holland. It was a channel for arts,
Okay.
and effectively they did some entertainment as well. And they did a UK Top 40, which was with a guy called Pat Sharp,
Right.
and a cat called DJ Cat. And effectively, it was the precursor to what became Sky as we know it today.
Right.
And so I went there for a job. I went there for two things. One was being what they call again a video engineer or a vision engineer, and the other one was a cameraman. And I, in the end, got the vision engineering role. And I was very lucky because I went to Sky and it was literally being formed. So Rupert Murdoch have taken over this channel. I came in. I was number 330 of the people that they took in Sky, and they saw that I had a little bit of experience, not much, 7 years experience, but I knew lighting, I knew many things. So they asked me to manage and look after the launch of Sky News. And effectively build the studio for Sky News, and so that was my project: was building the Sky News studio, and then taking it on air the first day when Sky launched.
Okay.
So that was my baptism by fire.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There I was, very young, in my early 20s. I'd been given this responsibility. If I'm honest with you, looking back at that, I didn't know the sort of the magnitude of the responsibility, because at the time, no one knew the channel. It was like this unknown channel. There was a gentleman who kind of sat next to me in rehearsals. His name was Rupert Murdoch. He would sit next to me. And he would sort of come in every Sunday while we're doing rehearsals. He would ask me a few questions. How's it going? What's going on? He just happens to always sit next to me because the chair was empty next to me. And he would be there, he'd come in his old jumper and he'd walk in and he'd look at what we were doing and how we were doing it, what the rehearsals were going on. And it was a special time. I mean, probably at the time I didn't recognize it.
You didn't recognize that, yeah.
But it was a very special time, yeah.
Wow.
And we worked crazy hours. I mean, we if I look back at what we did then, what people moan about now, I kind of didn't even think about it. Didn't even cross my mind. It was, I probably knew deep down there was something special going on, but didn't really recognize it. So it was very exciting.
Wow. There is so much in that I think
well,
I need to ask you about. that is, and especially I'm someone who works at Sky, right? So for me, this is like the history before the history that I've ever known. So this has been fascinating. And I recently did a Sky News tour, and to think that you were part of the original like starting of that's absolutely amazing. So one of the things that actually I wanted to ask you about is, so Rupert Murdoch he's built so much in this world, right? And a lot of people who work for him do very, very well. So what were some of the things that you learned from him? Because he is, like, whether people like him or not is another thing, but like he's obviously one of the great leaders of our time. So what are some of the things that you learned from being so close to Rupert Murdoch?
Well, I think there were a number of things. If you look at, and I think this is really important, and a lot of people do obviously have an opinion, and I understand that, and for various things that he's done over the last few years. But I think the one thing you can't take away from him as a leader is that he was willing to risk absolutely everything and genuinely everything to achieve what he wanted, which was, he'd been in newsprint for many years, started in Australia, obviously, and then reached out to a number of people to start this new sort of organization up. He really sort of, how can I say, he risked absolutely everything to achieve a broadcast organization called Sky. And to put it into context, we were losing when we joined forces. There was another channel which was literally opposing Sky, called British Satellite Broadcasting. British Satellite Broadcasting launched just after Sky had launched, and it was effectively a very high quality sort of output that was producing music, entertainment, movies, sport, so on and so forth. And it's a bit like the Betamax VHS race. You know, one of them had to win, and effectively, the problem with the other party was that they were very expensive, and they were going for everything quality. And Rupert was going for everything around how can I get the right content, rights, things like that. But it wasn't the same level. So the difference, to answer your question, is that he was willing to effectively not pander to what the other organization was doing, clear focus on what he wanted to achieve and why he wanted to achieve it, and effectively put every part of his organization at risk to achieve it. And they got to a point, a very, very famous story, this one, which is when we joined forces with British Satellite Broadcasting, or took them over effectively, he was losing per week £10 million. Now, that doesn't sound huge amounts in the days, but if you imagine back in sort of the early 90s, losing £10 million, every week was a huge thing. To a point where there was one bank he had to renegotiate on, and they wouldn't speak to anyone apart from speaking to him. It's a little bank in the middle of US somewhere, I don't know where, and he had to pick up the phone and negotiate with somebody who really didn't like him. Effectively, it's one tiny bank, and it was a very small bank in the US somewhere, had to come to a negotiation to agree a new deal. And if they hadn't, the house of cards had fallen down. But that's how close he was to losing absolutely everything. So I learned is he was very focused on what he wanted, and never deviated. And he was willing to bet everything to achieve what he needed. So as a leader, he was fearless, he was determined, he was focused, and he didn't deviate from the plan. So that's what I learned.
Love that. So slightly switching gears a little bit. So what does emotional intelligence mean to you?
Well, it's the most important thing for me in business. If I'm very honest, senior leaders in the organization, if you get them to do effectively a test for emotional intelligence, or EQ, you will find that they become these very red people. So in other words, they're people that don't have much emotional intelligence. And so it's a very rare thing for a senior leader to have emotional intelligence. They tend not to, because they have to make the difficult decisions. And unfortunately, with emotional intelligence, it puts the doubt into your thinking. It's like, if I do this, how will it affect people? Why will it affect people? So there's a balance between, using it appropriately, and sometimes you have to go the other way. And it's knowing when to use that EQ and that emotional intelligence to really benefit, what you're doing. So I think it's a really interesting one, and I think if you look at all the studies that have been happening over the last few years, they do recognise that great leaders are people that both are very strong, but equally have a level of emotional intelligence. And those leaders that are just, how can I say, very red, but don't have that same level of emotional intelligence, are very, very high achievers. But the people underneath them probably aren't that favourable with them.
Agreed. And I think it's one of those things. So I'm still quite early in my leadership journey, right? So I think it's one of those things where they're almost often pitted. You can either be one or the other, and like you said, like when you have to make the hard decisions, it's almost like the EQ side has to suffer. But I always wonder, like, is there a way that you can still make really hard decisions and still do the right thing by the business, but do it in such a way that the EQ side of it almost like, because if you've got to fire someone, that's a hard decision to have to make, but there must be a way, or I wonder if there's a way that can you still do that, but have a conversation in such a way that the EQ side is still front and center of this really hard decision, and both parties go away from it not necessarily feeling great because you've still got fired, right? But you're having a conversation in such a way that softens that, and it actually still works for both sides, and you're still amiable when you leave.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So there were a number of jobs I did at Sky. I ran Sky Sports operations, and I ran production services. And from an emotional intelligence point of view, I think when I ran sports operations, I was very much a different person. I'll unpack that later on. But from when I went into production services, I took that baggage of sort of how can I say, the lack of emotional intelligence and more the doing into that new environment, and I learned a couple of things. The job I was given was to transform the organization, and what that means is that I needed to. It was effectively around about sort of 1,300 people in that part of the organization, and it got too big, it got too unwieldy. No one understood how it ran. No one understood how much it cost to run. And effectively, I needed to do a really sort of a big job at cleaning up, looking at all of the workforce, looking at where we were putting value in, taking the value out that wasn't needed anymore, and so on and so forth. So I initially recruited 7 senior leaders who were what I would call very hyper sort of leaders who were very good at their job. And I took the baggage in of being very instructional. So this is how we're going to do it. This is why we're going to do it. And effectively, I did spend a lot of time with them right at the beginning to try and build them as a team, as you do. But then it got to a point where one of them came to me one day and said, "Look, Darren, look, we know you're very experienced. We know, that you've got all of the things, but you employed us because you are, you wanted a high performing team, but you're making all of those decisions. You're sort of, being the loudest voice in the room." And they said, "Look, this can't go on, because fundamentally what will happen is that, we'll just get bored with that. And effectively, we'll decide that that's not what we want."
So sorry, did they all approach you together, or one person was how did that go down?
Yeah, so I think initially it was a single person in a room, and then we had senior leadership meetings every week, and then they all broached it. One started, the next started, and so on and so forth.
Wow.
So I think initially, I think you kind of go, "Oh, okay, they're pushing back on me. This is not good. This is not good. I'm the most important person in the room here." So your arrogancy comes out a little bit. But I thought about a couple of things, and I thought to myself, look, there's 2 ways I can deal with this. I can either just ignore it and just become, continue to be the person I am, or I can adapt myself and change. And I tried, and I thought to myself, I'm going to go change. I'm going to, and I suddenly realised, and it took a few months, that all of a sudden I changed from being the very instructional leader to a mentor, and my responsibility to them became less about me being their boss and me being more their mentor, and it suddenly became a much more enjoyable experience, to a point where I was able to effectively lead them. But they became very elastic. And what I mean by that is that I could keep loading, because instead of the responsibility all coming to me, each of them became responsible for their areas. They knew that ultimately I was trusting them to be responsible for their areas. And it meant that whenever they had a problem or a difficult time, and some of them went through some horrendous times of their life from a point of view of having to downsize 300 people, go through that emotion that comes with all of that sort of baggage that you have to deal with. They knew that they could always come to me for counsel, guidance. But it wouldn't always be me making decisions. You know, they came to me and said, "Look, this is my problem." Blah blah blah. I'd listen, but then I would ask them the question, "What do you advise?" And I think that became very empowering for them, because they became, you know, most of the time we need people to sound off to. We need to talk. We're communicators.
Yes.
So they were using me as a way of effectively unburdening everything that was on their mind. And I was there to probably be the you know, the shrink kind of in the corner, listening to them, and you know, helping them to come to the right conclusion. So I think, to answer your question, the way that you sometimes have to adapt yourself to kind of be a really good leader is that you need to change your approach depending on the environment. And I need to put this very carefully. We were going through a massive transformation. So at the time, everyone needed that guidance, that help, that support, all the rest of it. So my role became that, which was, I was there to be the person who pointed to the things that, you know, we needed to do, set the tone and the direction for the organization, and they were the people who then enacted that out. So to answer your last question, just around how do we deal with people in difficult situations, sometimes we have to adapt, okay? And sometimes we have to tell the right story. And what I mean by that is that if you give people a clear map of where we're going and why we're going there, people may not be happy about it. People may push back at it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, people will understand. And I'll give you one final example of this, is that we had to, as I said, get rid of quite a few people who, you know, even were friends of mine and colleagues of mine that I've known for many years. But not one of them ever came up to me afterwards and said, you know, you're a horrible person. This is what it is. I remember walking, I was walking in an exhibition, and all of a sudden I saw 7 people grouped together, and there were 7 people that had just been left the organization. And I was walking towards them, and I thought, here we go. This is going to be great. And every single one of them came up to me and said, firstly, they said, Darren, how are you? You know, and I said, yeah, good. And how are you, all of you? And all of them went, you know, we're okay. We're all okay. And actually, you know, Fred's got this and James got that, and we're all good. And, you know, I sort of stood there and for a minute and was about to sort of say, look, you know, I'm really sorry what happened. And, you know, it's just the process. And then one of them said, look, Darren, we just wanted to say, we know it was tough for you. And we know that, you know, some of the things that you had to do probably, you know, were not things that you probably enjoyed too much. But we also want
that's a nice way to put it.
Absolutely. We also want to let you know that fundamentally we don't hold anything against you. We know what you had to do, and we know why you had to do it. And so that taught me one thing, is that I laid down the right foundations to let people know why we were doing it.
And I think something that I've kind of understood from the first story you told around, you know, when things weren't going well in your team approaching you, and even that situation, is that you've built an environment where people feel that they can actually talk to you about things like that. Because it's not everybody that you can go to your boss and say, look, what you're doing kind of sucks for me right now. Like something needs to change. Like, like that's a real psychological safety that you've been able to build there. So what were, like, when you were going into that role, what were some of the things that you did, if they were intentional or not, that you think built that psychological safety for people to be able to come and tell you, like, look, something needs to change, and give you that honest feedback?
Well, I think initially I didn't, and that's what I was saying. You know, I didn't. So what I adapted was I took away the things that were not good. So for instance, in meetings, I would lead the meetings, of course, but I have a very bad habit, and I still struggle to this day. And I'll be really honest with you about sometimes filling the gaps. You know, so which means that, you know, in a meeting, if I felt that there was too much of an air gap, I'd fill it. So
Okay.
what I did and how I adapted is I gave people the opportunity to breathe. I also gave the people, made them very clear, and I did it in a fun way as well. Sometimes I remember, constantly saying to them, "Your only job here is to make me look amazing." Um, and what I meant by that, in
Yes.
a nicest possible sense, is if you're great and you're great at what you do, and I'm going to allow the space to do that, you're going to be brilliant because I'm going to talk about you all the time. And I'm going to be brilliant because it's going to highlight the organization.
Yes.
And I think they like that because, and I always remember one particular lady who worked for me, and I had a real diversity in there, by the way. There was a real balance, female, male. It was not predominantly male or anything. It was real balance. And my goodness me, it was hard work because you're having to deal with like totally different people.
Yes.
But the great thing is that I would find that I'd be working, because I always worked silly hours. I worked like, getting a sort of 7:30 in the morning and leave at 7:30 at night.
Wow.
And I remember one lady coming over to me, said, "What are you working on, Darren?" I said, "Oh, this." She said, "No, I'm taking that from you. I'll do that presentation. I'm much better at presentations than you are." and I recognised that all of a sudden my team was starting to take from me because they wanted that responsibility, and it was like, and I'd go, "You know what? You're right." So I think how I adapted and how I changed was giving them permission, to your point, to challenge, giving permission to push back on things that they didn't agree. There were times, and I'll be really honest with you, we had to make decisions, and ultimately the buck would stick with me. If I didn't
100%.
agree with what they were doing, then ultimately there would be times where I would say, "I'm sorry, for these reasons, this is why we're doing this." But what I mean to say is, it got to a point where, from a senior leadership team, we had a really high performing team, to a point where, I used to get a lot of requests from different parts of the organization saying, "How did you go through that transformation?" And it was one of the first transformations ever in Sky. And so it was purely down to me adapting my way of working. That's what changed.
How did you know what you needed to adapt? Because now, if I want to understand about leadership or emotional intelligence, I can go on LinkedIn Learning, I can listen to podcasts, I can do anything like that. But this was still like probably quite early in the whole information age. So how did you know what you needed to change? How did you know what would be a good thing to try?
Because ultimately my team told me.
Wow.
So I mean, because to your point, I gave them the permission to kind of do that, and to a point. And then I'll give you another example. We did, in the early days, we did a lot of work as a team. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people just take their team away once a year or whatever, and they have an away day, and it's all nice and friendly and everything. We didn't. What we did is we did probably, I would say, about 3 months of really hard graft of everything from how we're going to run this department, and to exploring each other's personalities, to a point where we had this very uncomfortable sort of session, and it was there put in very cleverly by I won't say me, it was put in by my head of transformation, who is still at Sky, actually, and she put it there to basically expose all of our weaknesses, and what it was each of us stood literally face to face with each other. Everyone did it. And we were able, in this safe space, to tell the truth about each other.
Wow.
And that was a very telling experience. As you can imagine, I got slightly bruised from that episode, but it helped me to kind of work out, for each individual personality, what is the thing that doesn't get them motivated. What is it I'm doing that is causing them to be either unhappy with the things I'm doing, or liking the things I'm doing. So we did it two ways. One around, telling each other exactly what we felt. And I'll be honest with you, it got really, really difficult. And but it worked.
Yeah.
We all walked away from each other knowing, what the other person was thinking. And I think, to answer your question, I didn't need to go and research that on the internet, because effectively I was able to do it with the people that meant the most.
So, because for me, like, it sounds like you've hired people who are very good in that EQ space, right? Because for them to even have the awareness to raise it with you, it's quite an important thing. So I had a couple of questions on that. So what was it that you were looking for when you were hiring those people, and how did you identify that they could be good at that space? And then the second question is kind of separate, is you're receiving a lot of feedback, right? A lot of feedback that can be quite tough. What was going on in your mind, whether it's approaching that situation or coming out of that situation, that's enabled you to take it in such a good way?
Yeah. So the first one, just around how did I go out and hire the right people? I think that the one lesson I learned, and again, it was thanks to Jo, who was my transformation director.
Jo Curtis?
Yes, Jo Curtis. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's awesome. She's awesome.
There you go. So Jo Curtis.
I know Jo. She is awesome. Yeah. Okay.
And so you probably understand now.
Yeah. Now I understand that. Yeah.
So Jo Curtis, just for the people listening to this, has been at Sky a very long time, and she'd done lots of projects, and I'd worked with her for many, many, many years. And I hired her because she's incredibly good at unpacking problems, in a really good, logical way. And so I had a head of HR, and I had Jo Curtis, who was my head of transformation. And so Jo said to me, Darren, you're not going to hire people that look like you or act like you. And so thanks to Jo. She and my HR director worked on finding people that were very talented in the industry outside of Sky, not inside Sky, outside Sky, and didn't act and work like me. And now that sounds very odd, but when we were doing this, it sounded incredibly odd. If you did this today, you'd probably go, he's ticked the right box here. It is what he should be doing, but not then. I'm talking.
But this is before its time, though. This is way before its time. Yeah,
it was literally really cutting edge, and and I went to one particular, and she won't mind me probably saying this. There's a lady called B Divine who works at Sky now.
Yeah.
And B was working at a production company in London called Princess Productions.
Okay.
I just come from Sky Sports, and she was entertainment. So, and she won't mind me saying this, and I'm not being un-PC, but she was pink and fluffy and entertainment and all the rest of it. And I was told before I went to the meeting, Darren, she's totally different to you, which means that it's good. So feel what's
okay. It's good.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I met B, and I can tell you now, I came away feeling slightly underwhelmed, and thinking, not sure, but I'll give her a chance in the interviews, and we'll see how it goes. Anyway, gave her a chance, and can I say, wholeheartedly, B's one of my best friends. She is beyond talented, to a point where she was awesome, because I saw her grow from somebody who was, how can I say, a very somebody who would just take instructions and act on those instructions, to grow to somebody who was in charge, delivering, obviously now working on Sky Studios, and somebody incredibly talented. And that was an amazing thing to witness and be part of, and we became incredibly close as both. I was her boss, but equally as friends, because she was really talented. And my point is, I nearly didn't hire her, and I didn't hire her because I had unconscious bias that was in my head that somebody who was completely opposite from me wasn't the right person. And I hired everyone who was completely different to me and turned out amazing. And that became a really interesting thing. And then, of course, I had to manage people who were totally different. So that became difficult. That was probably your first question. I'm trying to remember your second question.
So the second question was around taking feedback. So what were the things that you went into those conversations to prepare yourself to get those feedback, and what was your processing after that enabled you to take on quite bruising or quite, I don't know what the word is, but quite strong feedback and quite vulnerable feedback?
Yeah, sure. And I think, look, let's be really honest, okay? No one likes being called out. No one. Okay? It doesn't matter who you are, if you're a senior leader all the way down to somebody younger. It doesn't matter. So I would never say the experiences were amazing and something I would, relish. But I think you have to unpack it afterwards. And there's times where you got feedback where you would disagree with that feedback. And there were times where you walk away and you go, yeah, I have been a bit of a idiot in that scenario. And the emotional intelligence part is the most important part of that. And what I mean by that is that if you have not very high emotional intelligence, you'd walk away doing two things. Firstly, that person's an idiot. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm not listening to them. And you'd go home and not even think about it. It wouldn't even cross your mind. It was like, that was an incident that happened yesterday, whatever. If you got emotional intelligence, and I hope, in some respects, I've definitely think I've learned it, you go away and you unpack that problem and go, you know what? Absolutely. And there's been a couple of occasions where I've gone away and I've gone, do you know what? That person was being really, really, really bad, but my reaction was even worse. And actually, I reacted really badly to it. And if you come away feeling, well, God Almighty, I've got to, and I've done that a couple of times. You realize you have to either try and change the situation, or it's going to wind you up for a long time. And so there's been a couple of times where I think I've walked away, unpacked it, realized I've been a bit of an idiot, and then had to go back. But the difference is, and I wholeheartedly will say this, if I'm wrong, I will 100% say, you know what, I was wrong. And I've learned that over the years. Many years ago, I would never have admitted I'm wrong. Now I'm probably the other way. You've got to have a balance. You really got to have a balance. But if I make a mistake, I will admit to my mistakes. But that comes with age, experience, and confidence. There are times in life you can't
security.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can't make the perfect decision all the time. No. Okay, you can't. It's impossible. We're humans. We make mistakes. It's recognizing those mistakes, either putting them right or at least apologizing for them.
And I think for me that was one of the things that was really admirable about your journey, is that first interaction with your team where they came to you and they challenged you on some of the things. I really loved your response in terms of taking it away, taking it on board, even from such an early age. Like, that is so important, because it's so easy to push back and be like, nope, I'm the boss, this is this. But I love the fact that you really actually chewed it, you took it away and you started making changes straight away. Like, for me, that's a massive takeaway.
Yeah, and I think just one last point. A lot of what I call senior leaders will see that as a weakness. That you are somebody that either gets wound up by people effectively doing something to you. And I think there is a balance in our work life. There are going to be times in our work life where you have to be a dictator, and it's a horrible thing to say, but you do. And there are other times in life where you need to really put that emotional intelligence into what you're doing. So I think the important thing is recognizing when you need to bring both tool sets in, and making sure that you use it appropriately. And look, it's a life lesson. You can never be perfect at it. I definitely not. I've made many mistakes along the way, and have repeated some of those mistakes, which is frustrating sometimes, because you think, I've done that before, why did I do it again?
Why did I do it again?
Yeah. But I think you have to recognize that sometimes we are human, and the emotional intelligence part of us also is the chimp inside us. So we've got to make sure that, sometimes that chimp is the thing that's winding us up. And it's our chimp brain that sometimes drives those bad sort of instant decisions that are probably sometimes not the correct ones.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing. And just as we close, is there any final thought that you have for the listeners in terms of what they can do to start developing their emotional intelligence?
Well, I think recognize what you're good at, but equally recognize what you're not so good at when you deal with people. I think the most important thing is, and this comes with time and experience, and I think it's something that you can read lots of books on, you can sort of look at YouTube, and everything's TikTok or whatever you want to do now. But fundamentally, you've got to discover yourself, and it is a process that you've got to go through. I think the most important thing for me to lead people on is that it's not a weakness to have emotional intelligence. It's a strength, a real strength. And I think if anyone can learn that strength and can apply it in business at a senior point, then they'll become great leaders. And I think it's important to understand that shouting and directing people will get you so far, but it won't get you to a point where you can look back at your career and go, wasn't I a great leader? You want to be able to, have people walk up to you and go, you know what, you were right. You put some heart. You were right.
Yeah.
So I think recognize it's not a weakness, and I think that's the last thing I will say on it.
I love that, and especially because it's really about the impact that you leave on other people. That leadership point that you've just made is about, yes, we got great stuff done, but there's also the fact of, okay, how did people also feel through that time? And I think what you've just said about people like genuinely being able to come to you and say, look, you were actually all right. I think that's what, as leaders, we all really want, is that even though I had to make tough decisions, people still were all right. People still understood. I still gave them what they needed. I had to make the tough decisions, but like you said, I was still all right. I love that.
Yeah, I think if I had my tombstone would be, he was all right.
He was all right. I love that. Honestly, Darren, thank you so much.
That's all right.
For your time and for sharing. It's been really inspirational for me, and I know it will be for everyone that listens as well. And yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It was very nice meeting you.
Good, likewise. And thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.